But what we're going to talk about today is really the relationship between buying and supplying. And buying, of course, is, a buyer works for a retailer who procures goods, and supply is really manufacturing. But where did it really all start? And I put this slide up here. Who are these people? Well, this is like 2,000 years ago, and this is the Cretans. And the Cretans were really the first to understand that they needed to trade in order to get mutual benefit. If you made sandals, you still needed to eat, but you didn't produce any food. So what did you have to do to get food? You had to trade, right? So they were the first to create a market. And you'd go to market with your sandals, hoping to trade your sandals with someone who had food. What if you didn't sell your sandals? You might not eat, or you'd be eating your sandals. Well, ironically, retail hasn't really changed a lot in those 2,000 years, because that's essentially what still happens is retailer brings something to market and hope that the consumer will like it, and if they don't, we're in trouble, right? There's things that have changed over the last 20 years that I think are important to note about where retail is going and why there's a shift happening here. The first is that fiscal accountability has really changed the retail landscape. It used to be that if you were a supplier of shirts and you wanted to sell a retailer, you'd go to the retailer and say, here's my great shirts, I want to sell them to you, and you'd make a deal, and you were done as a supplier. That was it. If the shirt didn't sell well, it wasn't the supplier's responsibility anymore. But today, in the global marketplace, it's all about profit, right? What you hear about is how companies do every quarter and how people invest in companies. And if a company doesn't make the number, what happens? They lose value. So the retailer is finding ways to spread the risk into the supplier, and that's something new that's happened in the last 20 years. The other is that national brands and private brands have changed. It used to be that there were large suppliers like Levi that dictated to the retailer what products they would have and at what prices they would have it at. And retailers have gotten smart saying, well, I can have my own brands too, and I can probably make more money on them. And that's changed the landscape. The supplier now has to learn to be more competitive against that. Sourcing has changed immensely. There was a time where all production was done here in the US, right? And what's happened in the last 20 years is China and India, it's become a very global marketplace. And so national brand suppliers and retailers have had to adapt to that changing environment. Technology has also changed. In the example before, where a supplier would go and sell shirts to the retailer and they would track sales, it was done in a very generic fashion. They just knew by looking at it whether something did well or not. Today, with information systems, you can see sales and inventory down to store level and by the minute. Every minute you can know how something is performing, and that access to data enables buyers and suppliers to make better decisions to assort the floor. The consumer's expectations have changed as well. Today, we want things like right now, don't we? We don't want to wait for something. If something is hot, we want to run to a store and get it. And we expect that the retailer's going to have it. And that wasn't so true 20 years ago. The ability to deliver goods faster has enabled retail to do that. The other big major thing that's happened is disposable income has risen and new markets have emerged, especially in tween markets. Tweeners are 9 to 12-year-olds that have more money than that age group ever had before. So new markets have emerged, and credit cards have come on the scene in the last 20 years that, even though it's really not money in your pocket, it's money in your pocket, right? It enabled people to go to stores and buy things whether they had the cash in their pocket or not. Brick and mortar retail has changed dramatically as well. 20 years ago, Dr. Weitz and I could list the top 100 retailers. Now you can barely list the top 10 retailers. So you've had consolidation and you have e-commerce growing. So everyone has to adapt to that. And finally, and probably the biggest change, is Walmart. And Walmart gets their own bullet. Until last week, they were the largest company in the world. Who took over, by the way, as the largest company? Anyone know? Someone just surpassed them last week in market value. Google. Google just, for the first time, beat Walmart. But Walmart in itself has driven globalization. Because what is Walmart all about? Low prices. How are you going to get low prices? You're going to go overseas. And so Walmart has drastically changed how we buy and supply. Let's talk a minute about supply and demand, because that's really what it's all about. And a buyer and supplier negotiate, right? I want to sell you something, you want to buy something from me. At the end of the day, we both want to make money. Who has the power in the negotiation? Is it the buyer or the supplier? What are some cases where a retailer has more power? Walmart, exactly. Walmart says, you want to come sell me something? These are my terms. You have these two people in the organization. You have the buyer at the retailer and you have the supplier. And generally, they're at the same level in terms of organization. Let's talk quickly about what does a buyer do. Well, in its simplest form, the buyer selects merchandise, right? It's the easiest way to say that. And hopefully they're buying product that matches their target market. They have to set pricing and promotional cadence. They have to say, okay, I'm going to buy this shirt. What's the right price so that you, the consumer, are going to buy it? And when should I put it on sale so that I can still maintain my profitability? They have to come up with a plan to do that. They're responsible for merchandising. They have to make the store look good. They have to make the shirts look attractive so when you come in, you want to buy it. And they have to provide customer service to do that. They have to determine the flow and delivery of product. So now I've bought a shirt, now I have to merchandise the shirt, I've got to figure out how to get it to the sales floor at a certain date so that it can live in its life cycle, so that's planning. And then they have to monitor performance. On the other side of the coin, you have the supplier. And the supplier is about design. The supplier is about product. And what they do is they're kind of the idea people to some degree that come up with the concept. So they design and source. And in order to do that, they generally travel around the globe and look for trends. Then they have to ensure that a product is going to meet all the federal requirements. You probably don't even think about this, but most of the things you buy have strict specifications around them. That iPod, that cell phone, even the shirt that you wear has strict government guidelines on how they operate. And a supplier has to put a lot of resources into ensuring that the product meets the specifications. In terms of product development, this is more of the types of who plays each role. But how does a product really come to market? That example of shirts. Well, someone had to have an idea at some point. It was either the buyer or the supplier that had the idea. Then it has to be sourced, and generally that's a supplier that's going to source it. They have to determine cost. The shirts that you wear today or the shoes that you wear today, somebody at some point had to sit down and figure out what it was going to cost to make 100,000 of those to supply the country or the store that they're selling. Now, different retailers have different strategies. And so we came up with this grid that kind of shows how retailers think and what they expect from suppliers. And up at the top of the chart, you see that if you're up in that area, the retailer expects the supplier to know everything about the product. At the bottom of the grid, the buyer gives no information whatsoever. Supplier has no idea how something is selling. And then on the left side, the buyer is very receptive to ideas that the supplier might give. And on the right side, on the left side, the buyer is not receptive to ideas. So what does that really mean? The top left corner, where Walmart is saying that Walmart provides a lot of data, sales and inventory data by the minute. And they also expect the supplier to manage the business. And I'll tell you why that is. Walmart is a 34, whatever it is, huge. In a quarter, they'll do $34 billion. In a given category, let's take the shirt category, could be $1 billion business for a year. $1 billion business. 4 people running the business. 4 people running $1 billion business. They have 3,400 stores, and they may have 1,000 SKUs on the floor. 4 people managing this. You think they can do a really good job at it? Probably not. And that's where the supplier comes in. So their model is to say, I'm going to buy the shirts, but you're going to manage it because we don't have the resources to do it. Then you have Target, and Target provides a fair amount of data, but they're not very receptive to letting suppliers help them run the business. But they're moving into the direction of that. You have Penny's, that's kind of in the middle in terms of providing data, but they're very receptive to it. And then at the bottom, you have Hot Topic. Hot Topic provides 0 data, nothing, nil. Supplier has no idea how something is doing. But if that's the case, then why are they more towards the area of the buyer being receptive to ideas? Well, who is doing all the product? Who is doing all the research to find the next trend? The supplier. So it's an interesting game that they play. The reason why we build a grid like this is that a supplier has to understand each of the retailer's strategies, because how they sell that retailer is going to be based upon what the expectation level is. And a supplier has to deploy the right resources to manage a retailer. So what does a buyer really do? There's a lot of people they can go to, right, to buy things from. There's a lot of manufacturers out there. So they look at certain things. One of them is, what brand does that supplier have to offer? Maybe the supplier is a category specialist, or they're broad-based. Price points. Price point obviously plays a big role depending on who the retailer is. They always want the best price, right? And also infrastructure plays a role. There's a lot of fashion houses out there that are suppliers that just don't have an infrastructure to be able to ship 100,000 shirts in a given season because they're too small to handle that. So that might be a concern. I like your design, but I'm not sure you're really going to be able to ship it to me. And service, of course, is important as well. What type of service does the supplier provide? If the retailer is going to ask more and more of the supplier to help them manage the business, they have to have the expertise to do that in the service. And then finally, another compelling reason to maybe go with a supplier is advantageous buys. And the Gap is probably the biggest company that does this. About 5 years ago, remember how big fleece was? Sweatshirts. You went into Old Navy and half the assortment was fleece, and in Gap half the assortment was fleece. What they did was, during the off-season, when people generally don't make fleece, but they have a lot of production open in their factories, the Gap went in and said, listen, I'll fill your capacity. I want you to make me fleece for 6 months, and I want to corner the market on this. But because I'm giving you production that you wouldn't normally have, you're going to give me a really good price on it. And that's what they did. And they brought the price of fleece down to be advantageous. Now, believe it or not, I know everyone in the room deals with grades, but for a supplier, it never ends. They're graded constantly. But they're graded on different things. They're graded on intangibles, and they're graded on some formal things. Formally, they're graded on sales and profit. How do their items perform? If I'm buying from you, it's got to perform well. They're tracked on turnover and GMROI. G-M-R-O-I. Does anyone know what GMROI is? Gross margin return on inventory. And that's really the name of the game today. What that is what we talked about before. If I'm investing $1 in a shirt, I'm going to buy a shirt from you for $1, what is my return on investment going to be from the retailer's point of view? I paid $1, I better get $2 out of it or $3 out of it. What if I only get a quarter? Wasn't a good investment for them, and a supplier is tracked on that. Same with in-stock. What that basically means is I have to always have enough of that shirt on the floor, and you always have to be able to deliver enough of that shirt to me, or it's no good. Then I'll have an empty space on my floor. I didn't plan for that, and now I'm losing sales. So they're graded on that.